Hallmarks of worldwide liberalism have shocked the world with the most unhinged statements about the genocide in Gaza. They're not just some random far-right grandparents at Christmas dinner. We're not talking about some random MAGA trolls on Twitter. They are the good guys. They are liberals. They love ethnic food. They have a diverse group of friends. Their favorite TV show is Euphoria, and they love to go to Pride every year. But, this is not the first time that the faces of modern liberalism have condoned violence against marginalized communities, and it will not be the last time. And I wonder to think, is it the phrase that scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds true? What is the real face of liberalism? I believe it's fair to say that liberalism is full of good intentions, but are good intentions enough? Good intentions in relation with what? Let's start by talking about what is liberalism. I will borrow a very simple definition of what liberalism is from Encyclopedia Britannica online, because this is not a video about the history of liberalism, as you can tell by the title. So, according to Encyclopedia Britannica online, liberalism is a political and economic doctrine that emphasizes individual autonomy, equality of opportunity, and the protection of individual rights, primarily to life, liberty, and property, originally against both the state and private economic actors, including businesses. The main figures who helped the construction of liberalism are the English philosopher John Locke and the Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith. Of course, like any political movement, the definitions and ideas are not set on stones and they transform with time. But this basic definition that I borrow from Encyclopedia Britannica is the basis of liberalism, and I believe it sounds amazing, right? It believes in equality, it believes in secularism, freedom, and human rights, like my type of thing. But we need to ask ourselves, who is defined as a person under liberalism? One of the most important events in the past 400 years is the French Revolution, an event that needs to be remembered. To call the French Revolution a liberal victory is an act of intellectual laziness, but a lot of liberals at the time supported the French Revolution, and liberals considered this event as a liberal victory. In the book Black Jacobins by the Trinidadian historian and writer C.L.R. James, he explains the relationship between the liberal bourgeoisie and slavery in the French colonies during the French Revolution and, of course, the aftermath of the French Revolution. The slave trade and slavery were the economic basis of the French Revolution. Sad irony of human history, comments Jaurès. The fortunes created at Bordeaux, at Nantes by the slave trade gave the bourgeoisie that pride which needed liberty and contributed to human emancipation. When discussing liberalism in the context of the slave trade, we're talking about the bourgeoisie who, even though embrace liberal ideas, have no interest in abolish slavery because they benefited from it. Slavery in the French colonies was abolished in 1848, but centuries after the victory of the French Revolution, France kept inflicting colonial and imperialist violence and domination onto its colonies, which is also happening to this day in 2024. And of course, some writers and philosophers from the Enlightenment movement like Voltaire and Diderot were strongly against slavery. But that doesn't mean that they believe black people were equal to white people. Classical liberalism saw that women, slaves, and indigenous groups don't have the same rights as white men. And to some extent, these ideas exist among liberals to this day in one way or another. Now, I'm going to jump a little in time and we're going to talk about liberals and Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy is victim of constant whitewashing, misquotes, and misinterpretations. He is often portrayed as being the opposite of Malcolm X, when in reality, they had a lot in common. Most of the misconceptions that we have about Dr. Martin Luther King is because of liberals. He knew it. This is what Dr. Martin Luther King said about liberals. The white liberal must rid himself of the notion that there can be a tensionless transition from the old order of injustice to the new order of justice. Two things are clear to me, and I hope they are clear to white liberals. One is that the Negro cannot achieve emancipation through violent rebellion. The other is that the Negro cannot achieve emancipation by passively waiting for the white race voluntarily to grant it to him. The Negro has not gained a single right in America without persistent pressure and agitation. However lamentable it may seem, the Negro is now convinced that white America will never admit him to equal rights unless it is coerced into doing it. And even though, like Dr. Martin Luther King has historically been celebrated by liberals, we need to keep in mind and remember that liberals didn't like him. It was actually both Robert Kennedy and J.F. Kennedy who authorized the FBI constant surveillance on Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, I want to jump a little more into present time and talk about liberalism in Sweden because, as you guys know, I live in Sweden and I have to talk about what's happening in Sweden. Moving forward to recent history and current events, there are countless of examples of liberalism around the world being a force against positive change in society. And I think there's an element of centrism in modern liberalism, but the concept of center is a concept that we need to address very carefully because the center in politics is an illusion because of how often that pole that is in the center, that is supposed to be immovable, moves all the time. So ironically, and I think that's part of the paradox of center in politics, the center doesn't exist because the center moves all the time. And we see this in current liberal politics, especially in Sweden. In Sweden, we have the Liberal Party, who's part of the current government. In Sweden, we have a far-right government formed by the moderates. Don't let the name trick you. The politician that is the Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, is from the moderates. We also have the Christian Democrats. That's pretty much self-explanatory, of course. And we have the Liberals, right? So all of these parties are working in collaboration with Sverigedemokraterna or the Sweden Democrats. So the Sweden Democrats, they come from the Swedish Nazi movement of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and it's a party which nowadays is full of literal Nazis. And when I mean Nazis, I mean like fans of a failed Austrian painter with an ugly mustache, Nazis. Swedish liberals are directly responsible for helping crafting some of the most far-right racist and fascist policies of the current government, like making it legal for the police to just stop and search people who they suspect are undocumented migrants, and turning migrant-majority neighborhoods into visitation zones. I want to make a quick parenthesis to explain what are visitation zones or visitationszoner in Swedish. So these are designated areas where the police can stop anybody, including children, search their belongings, their cars, and even body search them without any concrete evidence of suspicion, without a judge order, meaning that the police officers will have complete and absolute power to do whatever they want to the people living in these areas. Does that sound familiar to you? Some of the proposals coming directly from the Swedish Liberal Party are mandatory language tests for toddlers who live in migrant majority areas, and if they don't pass the test, their parents will be reported to social services, a civil registry of migrants, among other things. The liberals in Sweden openly embrace ethno-nationalism, racism, aggressive capitalism, and forced assimilation. It makes sense for the Swedish Liberal Party to work with the Swedish far-right and literal Nazis because they are, among other things, pro-privatization of healthcare and education, meaning that they are working very hard to destroy the Swedish welfare system. So, another quick parenthesis, I wish for the first time ever, the white working class understand that anti-racism benefits you because these racist zealots are also destroying the welfare system that has lifted not only you, but generations of white Swedish working class. Okay, go back. The Swedish liberals, they also want to give unlimited power to the police for them to stop and search people without any probable cause, just because the person looks like it could be an undocumented migrant. That means that someone like me, even though I'm a Swedish citizen, could be stopped at any moment and be body searched and have my civil rights violated just because I don't look like white. As professional bootlicker and Swedish liberal politician of Chilean descent, Mauricio Rojas openly said in an opinion piece, it is natural for liberalism to work with fascism because they're not natural enemies, since he interprets fascism as a complement of liberalism. Are these examples of broken liberalism? Or is this how liberalism is supposed to work? Are these the real faces of modern liberalism? Or liberalism only cares about aesthetic? Now, let's talk about liberalism and aesthetics. Jan Jönsson is a deputy for the Swedish Liberal Party in Stockholm, Sweden. He made headlines around the world when in 2023 he dressed in drag to protest the Sweden Democrats for wanting to ban drag queen story hour events for children. But here's the thing, and something Jan Jönsson forgot to mention when he became the face of queer rights in Sweden in the international press. His party works with the Sweden Democrats. Jan Jönsson is the perfect example of how modern liberalism only cares about aesthetics. Empty statements and the next cool thing they can support to seem progressive enough to be perceived as the good guys, while at the same time not only doing nothing to change things, but most of the times even hindering progress. Liberals care more about the aesthetics and how they present themselves rather than the substance. Liberals love doing meaningless symbolic acts to save face when it is convenient for them. Now let's talk about liberalism, colonialism, and white supremacy. The New York Times is one of the most prestigious newspapers in Western media. I have myself used several articles from the New York Times for my episodes, but the New York Times is very important in the landscape of modern liberalism, and we see it in their coverage of events like the war in Iraq and now the genocide in Gaza, like the infamous article of them celebrating IDF soldiers fighting in Gaza. White feminism and pinkwashing are common strategies in the modern liberal discourse, and I already did an episode where I focus on white feminism and white supremacy, but we see similarities in their strategies and even they use each other for their purposes, like famous American white feminist Chelsea Handler using liberal ideas and feminism to defend a genocide. Why liberalism always takes the side of white supremacy? For liberals, it's easy and cool to argue with stupid Trump supporters and reactionary, ignorant zealots, but in reality, they know these discussions will not bring any change in society. The objective is to make fun of them and make liberals look good. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy those videos and I do believe fascists should be shamed and treated with no respect. But I see these instances as self-serving and they ironically minimize the dangers of the far-right because it shows them like a group of disorganized, ignorant, and powerless people when in reality they are powerful and organized, but still ignorant, of course. What's the point of all this if, when it comes to some policies, liberals have more in common with the people that they make fun of. Liberalism is just a cool way to protect the status quo. Liberalism wants the victories that come with the social movement struggles not to only be watered down, but also to only be enjoyed by a few. White, cis, hetero men, and rich. Because even within liberalism, women still suffer, believe it or not. They steal agency from marginalized communities. Because liberalism sees people from those communities as things they can't have an equal relationship. They can't have an honest solidarity perspective towards those communities because those communities are not people. They are things according to their worldview. What we see in liberalism is not a way to improve people's lives. What they do is that they take social victories, achieve via revolutionary changes, via struggles and fights by marginalized communities. They water them down, and then they claim that it was thanks to them and sell stability at a very expensive price. The price being keeping the status quo, and the status quo involves white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalist exploitation. Something that liberal whitewashing of history does is that it also erases the fights of the communities. It erases how people organize and collectivism. And for this part, I want to quote Dr. Angela Davis, who explains this very well in her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Regimes of racial segregation were not disestablished because of the work of leaders and presidents and legislators, but rather because of the fact that ordinary people adopted a critical stance in the way in which they perceive their relationship to reality. Social realities that may have appeared inalterable, impenetrable, came to be viewed as malleable and transformable, and people learned how to imagine what it might mean to live in a world that was not so exclusively governed by the principles of white supremacy. This collective consciousness emerged within the context of social struggle. The same way racism and colonialism steals our imagination, I do believe liberalism also steals our imagination. It doesn't let us see the countless possibilities that exist within the human spirit. It imprints complacency and conformity into us. It tells us that this is the best it's going to get. Liberalism tells us not to try to make the world a better place. Liberalism is repack egoism with empty words to resell the loneliness of a life without community to the masses by stealing the real meaning of things like self-care and community. Under liberalism, self-care is not what Audre Lorde taught us, but it is to close our eyes to genocide. It is to make us buy more and more things that we don't need. Community in liberalism is the connections we can build with exploitation. Openness in liberalism is only within the imposed borders of white supremacy, and diversity are just accessories to enhance white people's experiences. Liberalism wants to decorate inequality and give symbolic victories as a bargain tool. Liberalism waters down history and even claims achievements it hasn't achieved. And when white supremacy and capitalism exploitation feels threatened, liberalism will do whatever it takes, including supporting fascism, as we see here in Sweden, for example. Liberal voices supporting the genocide in Gaza. Not all liberals defend the genocide in Gaza, but those liberals that do defend the genocide in Gaza use liberalism to support the horrible crimes committed against Palestinians by the Israeli government. This shows how violent and imperialist liberalism can be. And it's so ironic because while the US government is doing everything in its power to stop a ceasefire while sending billions of dollars to Israel, even bypassing congressional approval, would at the same time send black people to defend these atrocities as the face of them, while at the same time claiming to care for civilians in Gaza and demanding from a horrified voting base to please vote for Biden because he's the only one who can protect democracy and abortion rights in the US. So liberals are literally selling the idea that in order to protect liberal Western democracy, we need to condone genocide, we need to condone ethnic cleansing, we need to condone imperialism, and that's not true. We can build our countries and our communities without doing these things. And that's what I mean when I say liberalism steals possibilities. Liberalism steals our imagination. Liberalism steals our hopes. The same way some liberal voices saw slavery and colonialism as necessary evils to continue progress in the Western world, liberals nowadays see imperialism, capitalism, modern slavery, and colonialism as some of the forces behind progress in the Western world. But that doesn't have to be the case. And as a person who comes from the global south, I find it quite disturbing the excuses liberals make to justify the genocide in Gaza, because when time comes, does that mean that they will do the same thing to my country? Thank you so much for listening and watching. I want to read what you think about this episode. Do you consider yourself a liberal? Do you think liberalism is white supremacy? Do you agree with what I said in this video? Why, what not? Just tell me what you think in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe and share so this project can keep growing. You can find me on social media and most podcast platforms. I'm also on Patreon, where I have a lot of exclusive content, including exclusive episodes and essays. So go check it out. And I also want to use this opportunity to thank my Patreons for their support. Thank you so much for being my patrons. Once again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.